On the night of April 12, 1797, British ships cut through the dark waters of the Caribbean, heading west. Below deck, men, women, and children lay packed together, weakened by disease, hunger, and weeks of confinement. Many had already died. The survivors didn't know where they were being taken. They only knew one thing with certainty: they were never supposed to exist again. The British Empire had made that decision months earlier. This was not a migration. It was not a resettlement. It was an erasure. More than 5,000 people had been removed from their homeland on the island of St. Vincent, labeled too dangerous to live among Europeans. They were not enslaved, yet not free, not recognized as indigenous, yet not accepted as African. In British records, they were called Black Caribs, a category invented to justify what came next. The plan was simple: deport them to an island that couldn't sustain life. Let disease and starvation finish the job. Remove the problem from the Caribbean forever. But history doesn't always follow imperial plans, because today, more than 2 centuries later, their descendants are alive. Not scattered remnants, not assimilated echoes, a distinct people. Over 500,000 strong, spread across Central America and the United States, speaking a language older than most Caribbean nations, carrying a genetic signature so unusual that scientists still struggle to explain it. And when geneticists finally looked closely at their DNA, they found something that shouldn't exist. Not metaphorically, biologically, because the Garifuna genetic profile violates the pattern seen everywhere else in the Americas. Across the Caribbean and the New World, populations formed through chaotic mixing. Enslaved Africans, indigenous peoples, Europeans, the genetic contributions tend to blur together over generations. Maternal and paternal lineages blend. Ancestry evens out, but the Garifuna are different. Their DNA shows extreme order where there should be randomness, precision where history suggests chaos, a structure so consistent that it looks almost engineered. Modern genetic studies reveal that most Garifuna people carry between 75 and 85% West and Central African ancestry. That part makes sense, but layered on top of that is 15 to 25% indigenous American ancestry, not spread evenly across the genome, but concentrated in one place: the maternal line. Mitochondrial DNA, passed only from mother to child, tells a striking story. Nearly half of Garifuna individuals carry mitochondrial haplogroups A2 and C1. These are markers of indigenous Caribbean populations, not African ones. They trace directly back to the island Caribs and Arawak-speaking peoples who lived in the Lesser Antilles before European conquest. Now here's the contradiction. When researchers analyze the paternal side, the Y chromosomes passed from father to son, the indigenous signal disappears almost completely. Instead, the Y chromosomes are overwhelmingly African. Haplogroup E1b1a dominates, a lineage strongly associated with West and Central African populations. The same genetic markers found among Igbo, Yoruba, Fon, Ashanti, and Bantu-speaking peoples. So what does that mean? It means that generation after generation, Garifuna children were born to indigenous mothers and African fathers, with almost no reversal of that pattern. Not a few times, not occasionally, consistently, across centuries. No other population in the Caribbean shows this level of sex-biased admixture. Not Haitians, not Jamaicans, not Afro-Cubans, not Afro-Brazilians. Everywhere else, European, African, and indigenous ancestry mixed in complex, uneven ways. Paternal and maternal lines crisscrossed, but the Garifuna didn't crisscross. They aligned. African men, indigenous women, repeated so reliably that modern algorithms can identify Garifuna ancestry with remarkable accuracy. And that raises a question history never answered. How did such a precise genetic structure form and survive in one of the most violent, unstable regions of the colonial world? Because this wasn't isolation. St. Vincent sat in the middle of imperial competition. Spanish raiders, French traders, British planters, enslaved Africans arriving constantly on nearby islands, escaped slaves fleeing into the interior. War, disease, forced labor, and displacement were the norm. Everything about the Caribbean should have erased this pattern. Instead, it preserved it. To understand how, we have to go back more than a century before the British ever decided these people were a threat. Back before the British ever decided these people were a threat. Back to a shipwreck that shouldn't have mattered, but changed the genetic history of the Americas. Somewhere around the year 1635, a Spanish slave ship was moving through the Lesser Antilles carrying captive Africans towards plantation colonies. We don't know the ship's name. We don't know the exact number of people aboard. We know only that it never reached its destination. A storm hit. The ship broke apart near the coast of St. Vincent, and the captives survived. They reached land, not a European colony, but an island controlled by the island Caribs, also known as the Colonial. These were not passive victims of colonization. They were experienced warriors, navigators, and traders. They had resisted Spanish expansion for a century, raiding settlements, sinking ships, and maintaining control of their territory. The Africans who came ashore that day were not enslaved again. They were absorbed. And that single moment, a ship breaking apart on rocks, set in motion a demographic process so unusual that it still confounds geneticists today. Because the island Caribs didn't integrate these survivors randomly. They integrated them according to their own social rules, and those rules were matrilineal. Status, kinship, and inheritance all passed through women. When African men entered Carib society, they did so through marriage into Carib families. Their children belonged to their mothers' clans. They learned Carib language, customs, and identity from their mothers and grandmothers, but they inherited their father's Y chromosomes. And once that pattern began, it didn't stop. Within just a few generations, a new population emerged. Not African, not indigenous, something else entirely. They spoke an Arawakan language shaped by African rhythm. They practiced spiritual traditions blending both worlds. They identified themselves as a people apart. They called themselves Garifuna. And by the early 1700s, they had become so powerful that European empires took notice and grew afraid. By the late 17th century, something unusual had happened on St. Vincent. What began as the quiet absorption of shipwreck survivors had transformed into a distinct population that neither Europeans nor neighboring islands fully understood. The Garifuna were not simply Africans living among Caribs, and they were not Caribs who had absorbed African blood. They were a third thing, socially, culturally, and biologically, and that distinction mattered. Island Carib society had always been stratified by gender roles. Women were the anchors of community life. They controlled agriculture, household structure, and lineage identity. Men were warriors, traders, and diplomats, often traveling between islands. When African men entered this system, they didn't replace Carib men. They were slotted into existing roles. This is why the genetic pattern stayed so clean. African men married Carib women. Their children belonged to the mother's clan. When those sons grew up, they did the same. The daughters did the same. Generation after generation, the maternal line remained indigenous, while the paternal line remained African. There was no incentive to reverse the pattern. Carib women ensured cultural continuity. African men brought strength, numbers, and military skill. The system worked. And it worked so well that by 1700, the Garifuna population had grown into the thousands. European observers noticed immediately and uneasily. French missionaries and traders described the Garifuna as physically African but culturally indigenous. They farmed cassava, fished the reefs, and navigated canoes with Carib precision, but they also practiced African-derived rituals, drumming, and oral storytelling. Their villages were organized, disciplined, and fiercely independent. Most alarming of all, they refused European authority. St. Vincent became a problem island. Unlike Barbados or Jamaica, it never fully submitted to plantation slavery. The terrain was rugged, the population was hostile, and the Garifuna actively undermined European control by doing something unforgivable in the colonial imagination. they offered refuge. Escaped slaves from neighboring islands fled to St. Vincent in increasing numbers throughout the 1600s and 1700s. From Africans from Barbados, Martinique, Grenada, and St. Lucia escaped plantations and found protection among the Garifuna. Some joined their communities, others married in. Each arrival reinforced African paternal lineages without disrupting the maternal structure. From a genetic standpoint, this mattered. The African Y chromosome pool expanded and diversified, while the mitochondrial line stayed anchored to indigenous origins. That's why modern Garifuna paternal lineages trace back to multiple African regions, while maternal lineages remain tightly clustered. But to European planters, this was more than biology. It was rebellion. The British, in particular, saw St. Vincent as unfinished business. They wanted sugar plantations, they wanted land, and they wanted control over a region that kept bleeding enslaved labor away from profitable colonies. So they invented categories. In British colonial records, the island's indigenous population was divided into yellow Caribs and black Caribs. The distinction was not linguistic or cultural, it was visual. Yellow Caribs, lighter-skinned and more easily framed as indigenous, were sometimes tolerated, sometimes negotiated with. Black Caribs, the Garifuna, were something else entirely. To British officials, black Caribs looked African, and in the logic of empire, African meant enslaved by default. The fact that the Garifuna were free, organized, armed, and unwilling to submit made them an ideological threat. If Africans could live freely, resist Europeans, and build societies outside plantation control, then the entire racial hierarchy of the Caribbean collapsed. So the British narrative hardened. They portrayed the Garifuna as violent, untrustworthy, and inherently rebellious. Colonial correspondents described them as a dangerous race, naturally hostile, and incapable of civilization. None of this matched reality, but accuracy was never the goal. Control was. Throughout the early 1700s, tensions escalated. Treaties were signed and broken. British settlers encroached on Garifuna land. Surveyors were attacked or driven off. Plantations were sabotaged. Garifuna warriors used guerrilla tactics perfected over generations of island warfare. By mid-century, St. Vincent had become a geopolitical liability. The French, eager to weaken British influence, allied themselves with the Garifuna. They supplied weapons, they traded goods, and they recognized Garifuna land claims. This alliance deepened British paranoia. From London's perspective, St. Vincent wasn't just resisting colonization, it was a potential base for French-backed uprisings across the Caribbean. And then, in 1763, everything changed. The Treaty of Paris ended the 7 Years' War. France ceded St. Vincent to Britain. Overnight, the island shifted from contested territory to British property, at least on paper. On the ground, nothing changed. The Garifuna still controlled the most fertile land. They still refused plantations. They still sheltered escaped slaves. And now, the British were determined to resolve the problem permanently. They tried treaties first, land divisions that conveniently ignored Garifuna villages, agreements that assumed eventual submission. None worked. The Garifuna understood what British ownership meant. They had seen it on other islands. It meant sugar fields, chains, and extinction. So when British planters began moving on to Garifuna land in the 1770s, resistance became inevitable. Skirmishes turned into open conflict. Villages were burned. British patrols were ambushed. And by mid-1790s, the situation had escalated into full-scale war. This was not a rebellion. It was a defense of existence. The Garifuna were fighting for land, autonomy, and survival. And leading them was a man whose name still carries weight in Garifuna communities today, Joseph Chatoyer. Chatoyer was not just a chief, he was a strategist, a diplomat, and a symbol. He united Garifuna factions, coordinated with French allies, and turned St. Vincent's Mountains into a fortress. British troops found themselves fighting an enemy that knew the terrain, moved silently, and struck without warning. For more than a year, the British struggled, and during that war, the genetic future of the Garifuna hung in the balance, because defeat didn't just mean loss of land, it meant annihilation of a population whose very existence challenged colonial logic. When Châteauguay was killed in March of 1795, the war didn't end immediately, but the psychological blow was devastating. By late 1796, the British had the upper hand, and that's when they made their decision. Not imprisonment, not forced labor, not assimilation, removal. Total.
They would take the Garifuna out of the Caribbean entirely, and they would choose a destination where survival was unlikely. What followed the Garifuna surrender was not relocation, it was a calculated attempt at extinction. Between October 1796 and March 1797, British forces rounded up more than 5,000 Garifuna men, women, and children. Entire villages were emptied, families were chained together and marched to the coast. They were stripped of weapons, tools, food, anything that might allow survival. They were taken to Balasso. Balasso was a small, barren island just off the coast of St. Vincent. No fresh water, little arable land, no shelter. The British converted it into an open-air prison camp. This is where the erasure was supposed to happen. The Garifuna were held there for months, exposed to the elements. Food rations were minimal. Clean water was scarce. Disease spread rapidly. Dysentery, smallpox, fever. British officers kept records, not out of concern, but accounting. Each death was noted. Each body removed meant fewer mouths to feed. By the time the deportation ships were ready in March 1797, hundreds had already died. Some estimates suggest more than a third of the population never left Balasso. And then came the voyage. Survivors were loaded onto British ships and sent west, not back to Africa, not to another Caribbean island, but to Roatan, a small island off the coast of present-day Honduras. The journey took over a month. Conditions were brutal. One ship carrying nearly 300 Garifuna sank during the voyage. No passenger list survives. No death count was recorded. When the ships finally arrived on April 12, 1797, fewer than 2,500 people stepped onto Roatan's shore. Half the population was gone. The British sailed away, confident the remaining problem would solve itself. Roatan could not support that many people. The soil was poor, fresh water limited, food scarce. Starvation followed quickly. But once again, the Garifuna did something the empire didn't expect. They negotiated. Spanish colonial authorities on the Honduran mainland were struggling to defend their coast from pirates and British incursions. They needed experienced fighters. The Garifuna needed land. A deal was made. Within weeks, most Garifuna were transferred to the mainland near Trujillo. There, they were given land in exchange for military service. Villages were rebuilt, fishing communities established, crops planted. Against every expectation, the population stabilized, and this is where the genetic mystery deepens. Despite mass death, forced displacement, and resettlement in a new region among unfamiliar populations, the Garifuna genetic structure survived intact. Modern DNA studies show remarkably little genetic drift between Garifuna communities in Honduras, Belize, Guatemala, and Nicaragua. Despite being spread across hundreds of miles of coastline, their genetic profiles remain strikingly consistent. The maternal indigenous lineages persist at nearly the same frequencies seen on St. Vincent. The paternal African lineages remain dominant. The ratio holds. This is not accidental. The Garifuna practiced strong endogamy. Marriage within the community was encouraged. Cultural identity was fiercely protected. Language, ritual, music, and history reinforced boundaries, and memory did the rest. Garifuna identity was passed through women, not just biologically, but socially. Grandmothers told stories of St. Vincent. Mothers taught daughters who they were and who they were not. Children learned that survival depended on staying Garifuna. That memory preserved DNA. Even when limited admixture mixture occurred with Spanish colonists, with local indigenous groups like the Miskito or Maya. It layered onto the existing structure rather than dissolving it. That's why modern Garifuna genomes are complex but still identifiable. Autosomal DNA reveals a blend, roughly 3/4 African, 1/5 indigenous American, and a smaller European component, but the pattern remains asymmetric. Maternal lines indigenous, paternal lines African. It's a genetic fingerprint unique in the Americas. So unique that today commercial DNA companies can flag Garifuna ancestry even when users have no idea it exists in their family history. And that's how the mystery resurfaces. In New York, Los Angeles, Houston, Chicago, people take DNA tests expecting familiar results, African American, Caribbean, Latino, and instead find a strange signal. Indigenous Caribbean ancestry that doesn't align with known histories. African lineages paired in unexpected ways. Many discover their Garifuna without ever hearing the word before, because beginning in the mid-20th century, Garifuna communities migrated north in search of work. They blended into Black and Latino neighborhoods. The language faded, the identity softened, but the DNA remained. Now science is reconnecting families to a past that history tried to erase, and it confirms what oral tradition always claimed, that the Garifuna were never meant to survive, and did anyway. Their existence challenges everything we think we know about how populations form. They were not the product of slow colonial mixing. They emerged rapidly within a few generations. They maintained genetic order through chaos. They survived genocide, exile, and invisibility. Their DNA doesn't just tell a story of ancestry, it tells a story of resistance. Because every mitochondrial marker carried by a Garifuna woman today traces back to a Caribbean mother who refused to disappear. Every African Y chromosome traces back to a man who survived shipwreck, slavery, or war and chose freedom. The British Empire tried to erase them. History nearly forgot them, but DNA remembered. And now that memory is resurfacing in labs, in databases, in people who never knew why their results didn't quite make sense. The Garifuna mystery reminds us of something uncomfortable and powerful, that the past isn't gone. It's encoded, carried silently through generations, waiting to be read. If you found this story of hidden history and impossible DNA fascinating, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We explore the stories written into human genetics, the ones history tried to bury, but science is finally uncovering. Have you ever discovered unexpected ancestry in your DNA? Share your story in the comments, because we all carry history in our genes. The question is whether we're ready to listen.